With this, we have Dr. Murlidhar Rajmani. May I request Dr.
Yeah,
Murlidhar Rajmani to please take it over from here and chair the next session. Thank you so much.
thank you. I welcome one and all to this IC on this wonderful Sunday afternoon. So I have with me my panelists, Dr. Arun Sampranti, a prolific strabismologist from Bangalore, Dr. Shruti, one of the senior pediatric ophthalmologists in Chennai, and my colleague, Dr. Vaishnavi, and my mentor, Dr. Pradeep Sharma sir, will be joining in shortly. So with this, I shall start the first topic, that is issues in preoperative evaluation. So preoperative evaluation bears a very great importance in the overall strabismus management. So this is the flowchart for pediatric evaluation. I would say that vision and refraction occupy a prominent space, and you should not proceed further without recording the vision, refraction, and cycloplegic refraction. So vision in pre-verbal children can be recorded using Lee paddles. These are Lee paddles of varying frequencies. Just give me 1 second. Yeah, this is the Keeler Acuity cards. So this is the Keeler Acuity card, essentially a modification of Teller Acuity cards. And these are tests for sensory evaluation, namely Bagolini glasses. Bagolini glasses are very useful for checking binocularity. And this is the random dot stereopsis. So stereopsis also, I mean, it is the main reason why we do strabismus surgery, first of all. So refraction can be done using atropine, cyclopentolate, tropicamide, or cyclopentolate. Atropine in less than 5 years, CTC in older children, and humide in patients who have seizures or other neurological contraindications. So patients could come with a variety of head postures, and the head posture is brought about only when you ask the patient to look at the distance fixation target. So give the patient a distance fixation target. If you do the cover test without paying attention to the head posture, you may miss the strabismus. So if patient is very uncooperative and not allowing you to correct the head posture, you could patch one eye and then the other. Like in this patient where we suspected a left fourth nerve palsy, we patched the right eye. We patched, which could be the involved eye, but the head posture didn't right itself. So possibly strabismus is not an issue in causing the head posture in this child. So the importance of refractive error in strabismus is that other important features is that it could cause amblyopia. There could be an accommodative component. High strabismus errors could influence the measurement, and of course, high refractive error itself could cause strabismus, like in myopic strabismus fixes. So when correcting the refractive error, we correct the full plus in esotropia, anything above 1.5 in less than 5-year-old children, and above 5 years, we give the maximum tolerated plus that is compatible with 6/9 vision. We could give the full minus in exotropia. That is, you could even over minus. There are special categories of patients where you could over minus. Select patients. You give the minimal plus in exo. Having said that, any hyperopia more than 5 diopters mandates correction in children less than 5 years. So these constitute the dynamic factor in strabismus. And before you take up a patient for strabismus surgery, you should have completed with the amblyopia management. Either the amblyopia should be refractory or the improvement should have stopped happening. In certain select cases, like in congenital third nerve palsy, you do strabismus surgery before amblyopia. But as a prelude to strabismus surgery, amblyopia management should have been done. So the importance of refractive error can be highlighted by this patient. So this patient seems orthophoric. When you give the patient a distance fixation target, she develops a esotropia. Okay, here again, if the mother says the child has strabismus, you don't find any, do give the patient a fixation target, an accommodative fixation target. A torchlight should never be used. So with plus glasses, when you give the patient the appropriate hyperopic correction, so there is no strabismus. So this is a dynamic squint, and only glasses are to be given for this patient. Now watch this patient. This patient requires 2 prisms. The strabismus is above 45 diopter. To be precise, it was close to 60 prism diopters. We give the patient the glasses, the maximum tolerated plus that was compatible with 6/9 vision. Once you give the patient the glasses, the esotropia comes down. So this is a partially accommodative esotropia. You can see the difference here. And in partially accommodative esotropia, you should correct only that part of strabismus which is not corrected with glasses. That is the static part of the strabismus. So now note this patient. So there is absolutely no difference. So this is a non-accommodative esotropia. This was an infantile esotropia, even though she had hyperopia. There is no change in the strabismus with glasses. So this patient goes for surgery. I mean, presuming amblyopia has been corrected. So to highlight the importance of refraction, watch this patient. This patient has a esotropia, and you're able to measure without the glasses. When you give her the glasses, she goes overboard. Okay, she loses that convergence and she develops exotropia. So these are strabismus patients that you should watch out and should not take up for surgery because they have a lot of dynamic factors. So now you should make sure that the prerequisites for cover tests are satisfied. And please note that plus glasses more than 4 diopters always measure less, and myopic glasses give higher values than the actual measurement. So this is the formula that I have taken from Pradeep Sharma sir's book. So this is why this happens whenever the refractive error is more than 4 diopters. So plus glasses induce a prismatic effect, and so do minus glasses. So the measured deviation is less than the true deviation with plus glasses and more than the true deviation with minus glasses. So you also have tables when you combine prisms. There is 50 prisms in front of one eye and 12 prisms in front of the other eye. It is not 62, it is 66 prism diopters, more than that. I have taken this table from Rosenbaum, and this is very important because when you measure large deviations, you tend to take the algebraic sum and formulate your surgical plan accordingly, but it is not so, and it can introduce errors in your in the result. So even before we say that a child has strabismus, please note that you should exclude a positive, exclude a pseudostrabismus. So this patient on a cover test is fully orthophoric, but if you just do a Hirschberg or a Krimsky, this patient seems to be having an exotropia. So, of course, this patient also doesn't go for surgery, neither does this patient. The mother complains of strabismus, but this patient has epicanthus inversus. So if you bunch up the skin on the nose, the strabismus could go, or if you just do a cover test. Always use accommodative targets for cover test. Pay very careful attention to the history, the mode of onset of strabismus. So it was recorded that this patient developed strabismus after head injury. So it was not actually head injury. She was traveling in a bullock cart and she sustained injury with a hook that was used to suspend a lantern. So that was a sharp injury, and this is the intraoperative photograph. If you see carefully, there is a scar over the lateral rectus. So it is a lateral rectus avulsion, and we couldn't retrieve the lateral rectus. So we did Hammershim's procedure. So it is useful. This should not come as an operative surprise. If you are careful in your preoperative evaluation, you would be ready for this kind of an eventuality. So that was the pre and post-op. And this was a very interesting patient. This patient sustained trauma with an iron rod and had a chin down head posture. We suspected avulsion because the IR was also collapsing out of the conjunctival tear. But on MRI, this is the preoperative picture, but on MRI, so the patient seemed to be having what is called a flap tear, that is a partial tear. And when we explored her, the orbital layer was lying free. So the orbital layer was simply excised, and that restored the alignment. It was just acting as a hindrance to depression, a mechanical hindrance to depression. So the orbital layer was sacrificed, and we managed to restore a very good alignment, complete alignment with no diplopia in any case in this patient. So this is the flat tear, and this resection of a hindering orbital layer has been reported in JAPOS. It was not our paper, it was Raab et al.'s paper, but that helped us guide. So now, it is very difficult if you get, surprises on table. So this patient had an exotropia since childhood, was operated in another hospital. She said only the right eye was operated, but both eyes were red. Mother remembered that both eyes were red after surgery. There was no record of left eye surgery at all, but there seemed to be a scar over the left medial rectus. So patient had a preoperative exotropia that time also. And mother said there was not much difference after surgery. I don't know why this happened, but if you see here, the medial rectus on the left side, instead of being resected, I'm sure the surgeon planned resection, but for some reason it has been recessed, or it has slipped. We don't know. Or it has slipped. Rather than blaming the surgeon. So we were ready for this kind of an eventuality because preoperatively we saw the conjunctival scar on table. Okay, so it is very important that you have a careful preoperative evaluation. And if you notice very carefully, this patient seems to have an A pattern. We did not operate on the obliques. Rather, what we did was this medial rectus, over recession of medial rectus that was causing the esotropia. So, this patient is having cosmetic contact lens here that caused the A pattern. So we were ready for this eventuality. And please also note that she has a small leftosis. which persisted in the postoperative period. So all these factors need to be noted down in your operative, in your pre-op case sheet. If you don't do this, not only can you land up in medical legal issues, but you can land up with unpleasant surprises on the table. So the significance of a pattern strabismus is that if you fail to recognize and treat, then you end up with a very bad result. So this is a pattern esotropia, and this is a V pattern esotropia. So this is a V pattern exotropia and A pattern exotropia. So we often, all of us have faced the situation that children are not very cooperative and there's that, but parents are very insistent on strabismus surgery. But what Pradeep Sharma sir always says is that it is not important how soon you operate, but how soon you align. Pattern strabismus is very, very important. Please do look for the oblique overactions. This is the schema for treating pattern strabismus, and you can tailor accordingly. Please grade the oblique overaction and select the appropriate procedure. Selecting the appropriate procedure will be covered in subsequent presentation. And this is a superior oblique 4+ overaction. So a nasal procedure has to be done to correct it. And also learn to recognize pseudo-inferior oblique overaction. There is no R by L here or no R by L here or no L by R here. But there seems to be an up and down shoe. This was because of a tight lateral rectus. And we only did lateral rectus recession, bilateral lateral rectus recession and left medial rectus resection. And now there is no oblique overaction. It's because of the leash effect of the tight lateral rectus. So for paralytic strabismus, very important to know whether the muscle is working, lateral rectus is working or not. So in this patient, the globe is crossing the midline. And yes, in case the globe is not crossing the midline, then you have to do a GT and saccadic analysis to know. So if the globe is crossing the midline, a recess resect procedure works very well. And if the globe is not crossing the midline, like this LR is not working, then there is no, then you need to do a transposition procedure. So you have a number of transposition procedures available. So, and thank you so much. And I'm sure paralytic strabismus and others will be covered in the slides to come. So any comment, Sharma sir?
I think it's a wonderful presentation, Murli. You have basically introduced the subject very nicely, that what things should be covered, and specifics will, as you are planning, it will come one by one. But whatever points you have raised are really relevant for taking into account. For example, the deviations that you mentioned for accommodative esotropia, we should be taking the non-dynamic deviation which is there, and the V and A patterns we should be taking care of. Another thing which I may add is that near distance disparity is another thing which may sometimes have a confounding problem, that the deviations are different for distance measurement and near measurements, and that we may have to take into our account for surgery. So some specific procedures, for example, it's a convergence excess, you may add a Farden on the medial rectus. But if it's a late divergence excess, that has always been a problem. And recently we have started doing this combined resection and recession on the same lateral rectus. So that's another thing which may have to be taken into account.
So we move on to the next talk. Now I request my colleague, Dr. Vaishnavi. She is a pediatric ophthalmologist working with me at the Eye Foundation, Coimbatore. She'll be talking on a step-by-step guide to conventional surgery on the horizontal vector.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm here to talk about strabismus surgery, the basics. So the checklist includes assessment of vision by age-appropriate test for recognition of amblyopia and the binocular status. So full cycloplegic refraction and proper correction is mandatory. Always do a prism cover test with glasses for both distance and vision, and for both up gaze and down gaze. Always do the test for binocularity and look for the A and V patterns and for lateral incompetence. And even the systemic risk factors has to be taken into account. This is a 78-year-old male patient with a right hypertropia. He is a diabetic, hypertensive, and he had got an aortic aneurysm rupture twice with a chronic renal failure. So I would think thrice or even 4 times before I take this patient for surgery. So what are the common mistakes in evaluation? Hirschberg alone is not sufficient, and we should not ignore the accommodative factors. And in any case of monocular squinting with very poor vision in the squinting eye, the refraction of the normal eye is a must. Always correct amblyopia before you take the patient for surgery, and poor cooperation is predicted in the age group of less than 2 years. So you make sure that you get a reliable and stable measurement before you jump in for surgery. So what are the tests on table? It includes deviation under general anesthesia, force reduction test, and spring back test of Jampolsky. So this is a video showing a force reduction test. So this distinguishes between the underaction due to restrictive or a paralytic strabismus. So after anesthetizing the cornea, the eye is held at the limbus with Pierce-Hoskins forceps and is passively moved, taking care that the globe is not pushed into the orbit, and the patient is asked to look in the direction of action of the paralyzed muscle to relax the antagonist. So coming to the anesthesia involved, so we can give a general anesthesia, local, subtenons, or a topical. So the sutures which are commonly used for muscle, we use 6-vicryl, and this is an exam question. So vicryl, why? It is a polygalactin which is made up of glycolic acid, lactic acid, which has a coated polygalactin 370 with calcium stearate, which makes the surface smoother and reduces the tissue drag. Conjunctiva is usually closed with 8-vicryl, and 5-polyester is used for chicken suture, Fadden, and Foster. So always choose the right surgical procedure and the technique you are experienced with. And this is from Dr. Pradeep Sharma's book, For Getting Your Numbers Right. So these numbers are just a general guideline. So they should be modified based on the surgical experience. Do at least 50 to 60 cases initially, and each of us has to painfully work it out. This is also for exam going purpose. So 1 millimeter of medial rectus corrects up to 3 prism diopters. For less than 2 years, it's around 4.5 prism diopters. And 1 millimeter of lateral rectus corrects around 2 prism diopters. And medial rectus and lateral rectus is in the ratio of 2:3. The medial rectus has got a lesser arc of contact, and lateral rectus is a much forgiving muscle. So if you combine resection and recession, you get a 25% bonus. And these are the limits. For vertical recti, minimum is 2 millimeters, maximum is 5 millimeters. For horizontal recti recession, medial rectus, minimum is 3, below which it doesn't work, and maximum is 6. And lateral rectus, minimum is 4 and maximum is 8. For horizontal recti resection, medial rectus, minimum is 3 millimeters, the maximum is 6, lateral rectus is 4.5 and 9. So preoperatively, you can give the patient topical antibiotics, cleaning and drapal as usual. Blade speculum is usually preferred. So coming to the incision. So we have the limbal-based incision, fornix incision, paralimbal, and over the muscle incision or swan, and minimal incision strabismus surgery. So weakening procedures, most common involved is a recession, followed by tenotomy, myectomy, Botox injection, and inactivation. Strengthening procedures includes resection, tucking, plication, and advancement. So coming to the muscle exposure. So before you exercise a muscle, always do a force reduction test on table. And the conjunctiva is incised with the blunt end scissors. And 2 radial incisions are made in the conjunctiva. The intramuscular septum in the supranasal and the infranasal is buttonholed. So then the muscles are hooked, first with the von Graffius hook, which is passed hugging the sclera. Then with the Green's hook, which is passed, ensuring that the entire muscle is being hooked. Then the check ligaments and the intramuscular septum are separated under direct vision, preventing any injury to the vessels, fascia, or the muscle sheath. And excess of any Tenon's capsule in and around the muscle insertion is carefully excised. Coming to the recession, after you hook the muscle, So interlocking loops of 6/0 vicryl needles are passed and the knot is secured at the ends of the muscle insertion. This is done on the either side, opposite side with the reverse suture. Then the muscle is carefully cut. This is 2-1-1 through. So muscle is carefully cut with the tenotomy scissors, leaving a stump of around 0.5 millimeters. So the measurement for recession with calipers are made from the upper and the lower ends, which are never directly handled with the fixation forceps to prevent any induced shift. Always hold the fixation forceps perpendicular to where you have marked. Now 2 spatulated needles are passed paralimbal away from each other, ensuring a width of about 8 to 10 millimeters. You should be able to see the length of the needle throughout. Then the sutures are tied with the surgical knots, and the other person holds the knot to prevent any slippage. And it's better to leave the long at the ends. Next, coming to resection. So measurement of resection is made with the calipers, ensuring that the muscle is not stretched during the marking. Then the second hook is passed. Make sure you don't stretch the muscle too much. Then 2 double-armed 6/0 vicryl sutures are passed full thickness in interlocking fashion to hold the muscle. This is repeated on the other side in the reverse direction. Then the muscle is cut carefully, leaving a stump of around 0.5 millimeters. Then the needles are passed through the stump so that the upper and the lower pair has at least 5 millimeters of separation. So we all know that the sclera anterior to the muscle insertion is thick and posterior is very thin. So chance of perforation is higher posterior to the insertion. So attach the muscle closer to the insertion. Make sure there is no sagging of the muscle. This is repeated on the other side. If at all there is any sagging, additional suture is always put. The conjunctiva can be closed with either tissue glue or with the 8-toe vicryl suture according to the surgeon's convenience. Thank you.
Shruti, you want to take any comments on that? Shruti, any comments from your side?
No, I thought it was a fantastic presentation, sir. Excellent videos, and I really enjoyed it. It was like reliving proper surgery revision, you know, how we learn it the proper way. So I enjoyed your surgeries, and fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
But I have a question for Dr. Pradeep Sharma, sir. Sir, what is your advice to beginners who are starting strabismus surgery? How do we make sure that they don't have a very steep learning curve?
One would be that one should practice the suturing on in the surgical skill lab if you have one, or on the goat's eye. At least the suture practice should be done. There is a nice article by one of our junior colleagues, Dr. Amar Pujari, on using the goat's eye muscles. Normally, the goat's eye is used for corneal suturing and for maybe a little bit of cataract lens surgery. But even for extraocular muscle surgery, he has mentioned that you can request that, and the muscle is there. You can practice on that too. So that is one thing which one can start with. Otherwise, a limbal incision, as you had shown and Dr. Vaishnavi had presented. So that is an initial step to start with, rather than straight away going on a fornix incision, which may be a little more difficult. So after a few surgeries on limbal incision, one can do the fornix incisions, and it would be proper.
Now I request my good friend and my senior, Dr. Arun to start his next talk. So Dr. Arun Shampranti is a senior pediatric ophthalmologist practicing in Bangalore. He was a medical officer in Arvind Rai Hospital, Coimbatore, and has been trained by Dr. Kalpana. And he'll be talking on a beginner's guide to incorporating adjustable strabismus surgery in your practice.
Thank you, Dr. Murli, and it's an honor for me to present in front of Dr. Pradeep Sharma sir. So I'll be talking today about adjustable suture surgery. So there is a quote telling that the best gift in life is a second chance. So how about if you are given a second chance in doing a strabismus surgery to correct your alignment? So that is precisely what is adjustable suture surgery. So it allows the surgeon to fine tune the alignment. Suppose you have planned for a squint surgery and the alignment has not been very good. So it gives a second chance for you to revisit your alignment. So it's then a two-step procedure. So first is a standard strabismus surgery, as Dr. Vaishnavi has demonstrated. And instead of tying the knot, we put a slip knot so that you can release it the next day after the anesthesia effect wears off. Then again, you check the movements, you do a cover test and see how is the alignment, whether it is as per your plan. So if it is as per your plan, you just tie the knot. Otherwise, you can adjust it. You can move the muscle either forward or backward so that you get a good alignment. So whom you can adjust? One is incomitant strabismus, small angle strabismus, particularly resurgeries. It's very useful because the predictability of the normal nomograms is very less with resurgeries. So there it is very useful, and also restrictive strabismus. And for some surgeons, any surgery, all strabismus surgeries they do under adjustables. Whom you cannot adjust also is important, because very small children you cannot adjust, and very anxious and nervous patients, definitely it is better to avoid adjustable suture surgeries, and also those with poor pain threshold. So selecting your patients carefully, it's very, very important, because it causes adjustment causes a lot of discomfort, and the patient should be able to bear the pain. So a simple test called this Q-tip test is a very good test to assess whether the patient will be able to tolerate the pain or not. So just on the unanesthetized conjunctiva, just take a earbud and try to gently touch the conjunctiva. So if the patient can tolerate this, then probably he'll be able to cooperate for your adjustable suture surgeries. So when to adjust? So adjustment needs to be done after the anesthetic effect wears off. So it depends on which type of anesthesia you're using. So if you're using a local anesthesia, usually we use a combination of xylocaine and bupivacaine. So it takes almost about 6 to 24 hours for the effect to wash out. So it's always, if you particularly use bupivacaine, it's better to adjust the next day. So coming to the incisions, as Dr. Pradeep Sharma has very nicely said, incision should always be comfortable for the surgeon. So I would definitely suggest all the beginners to go for a limbal incision, because it gives a better exposure and you can do a good surgery, whereas experienced people can shift over to the fornix-based incisions. So this is the most commonly done type of adjustable suture. I use this bow tie technique. So here you tie a bow tie after putting the first knot, so that you can release it the next day and adjust the position of the muscle as per your requirement. So you just go to a small video about how we go about doing this adjustable suture surgery. So as I said, I'll be using a limbal incision here so that you get it. And then you hook the muscle. And once you hook the muscle, you dissect it from the surrounding tech ligament. And I also used two separate single arm sutures on either side of it. Some people use a single arm suture, the central bind. This is very, very important. You have to secure the muscle tightly, otherwise you may end up with a loss. So I've tied two sutures on either end of the muscle, and now I am distance setting the muscle. it okay? Yeah. Sorry. So now the sutures are tied here. And now see, this is the intended amount of precision what I wanted. And now I'll just put a single knot. I will not put a double knot here. I'll just put a single throw and then take a bow tie. So this bow tie can be released next once the anesthetic effect wears off and the long ends of the sutures are trimmed and the conjunctiva will be closed. So here you cannot use a glue because you want to open the conjunctiva next day. People doing topical anesthesia can do it immediately, but people will with the local anesthesia. So here you can see the post-operative alignment, it's bang on. So he has a perfect alignment, so there is no need for me to adjust the position of the muscle. So suppose if you had an overcorrection or an undercorrection, then you can adjust the position of the muscle and get an appropriate result. In fact, you can again put a bow tie after putting the alignment and then do a cover test and then go back to the muscle to tie the final knot. So since this patient doesn't need any adjustment, I'm just putting the final knot here and closing the conjunctiva. So there is another technique called the sliding noose technique, where you put a sliding noose like this. So this noose can slide over the entire length of the muscle suture. So this is also a good technique incorporated by some surgeons. The complications of adjustable sutures, main thing is the pain. The patient has to be like the pain threshold should be good. They have to bear for the thing. Otherwise, again, you have to give a local anesthesia for adjustment. And nausea, vomiting, oculocardiac reflex during adjustment is a possibility. Suture breakage is another important thing we have to remember. So should be handling the sutures very carefully. And if you're doing a very large recessions, then there is a possibility that the muscle may come forward. So creeping of the muscle forward and leading to inappropriate post-operative results. So in conclusion, adjustable suture is a very good technique in selected cases. It gives a second chance for the surgeon to perfect the result. And most importantly, the beginner should not be misled that adjustable will always give a perfect result, because as I said, there could be some changes in the final place where the muscle get attached and give to late changes in the alignment. So in conclusion, I would definitely recommend adjustable suture surgery in the indications which I have just mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arun. I have a few questions. One is that in case you don't want to adjust, if the alignment is very good, do you go back and tie off the bow tie suture?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I did in this patient.
Okay, and how much of leverage do adjustable sutures give you? I mean, how much of error in the expected outcome can they correct?
You can adjust, see, because basically it depends on how much is the initial reassessment, so initial recession. So if you've done a very small recession initially, you can definitely put the muscle backwards as much as you want. But very large recessions, I would not recommend, because I said that creeping of the muscle forward is a possibility. So in that case, the final result may not be as expected.
Sharma sir, any comments?
Yeah, I think it was a very nice presentation by Dr. Arun. It was really nice to see that. Just a few comments. One was that when you are doing in the limbal approach, you need not put these cut the sutures at the time of adjustment. You rather keep the sutures exposed at the limbus, and when you are adjusting, you just untie, or if you have to adjust, you adjust. Otherwise, just trim them, and then you don't have to re-suture the conjunctiva. So that will save your problem, because most of the time the second thing that your adjustment may not be requiring a full OT setup. Yes, but if you're doing this way, that you're resuturing, you will have all the work to be done again, the 8-0 vicryl suture to be put again. Yes. So you can avoid that. You can just keep the sutures exposed through the limbal approach, and that's the advantage of limbal approach actually. The other thing which I saw Dr. Rosenbaum doing was passing an anchoring suture just close to the limbus with the 6-0 vicryl leftover that you have, and that will act like a bucket handle. So because at the time of adjustment, holding the globe sometimes becomes a problem with the fixation forceps, and the tissues are friable and the patient is awake and he's moving the eyes, so it can be a problem. So if you have a hold on the globe by an additional anchoring bucket handle suture, that also helps. So that is second thing. Third, what you were saying, that creeping forward is really a problem. So for that, what you can do is, which I do, is not a full hangback for adjustable. I always do a hemi hangback. So I have a room for example 3 to 4 millimeters of adjustment. The rest I would pass the sutures in between the insertion and the point of where I want the muscle to be. You get me? So it's I
Yes,
might
yes.
show you one slide on that. So that is a
Modified hand.
hangback which will take care of the complication of creeping forward. So many a time we have to do larger also, and many you'll require. So you can have a hemi hangback suture.
You're muted, Dr. Muralidhar.
We have a few questions, so any of the panel members can take it. One is, the first question is, do you need pupil dilatation during strabismus surgery? We never dilate the pupil, but many times the pupil gets dilated when we give a block or we give subcutaneous anesthesia. The other is, when do you measure from the limbus and when do you measure from the insertion for recessions? That is the second question.
Measuring from the limbus would be for the infantile ESOs, because that's where they are having anomalous insertions to begin with. And I think it would be prudent to measure directly from the limbus. For any other condition for adult strabismus, I usually go from the insertion.
And also when you're having resurgeries, then again, you may have to take care of the limbal measurements because you are not sure and the insertion is not a reliable landmark at that point. Then you can measure from the limbus.
So we shall move on to the next talk on oblique surgeries. Okay, so I'll be talking on oblique surgeries. So we have a number of weakening procedures on the inferior oblique. It is, we don't do strengthening procedures generally except in torsional Kastenbaum. So we have a number of weakening procedures. They include graded recessions, which we most commonly do. The other procedures are mainly of historical interest. Common indications for surgery on the inferior oblique is pattern strabismus with oblique dysfunction and DVD. Also in paretic strabismus, lost inferior rectus. Also, you can do an inferior oblique anteroposition. So these are a few indications. This patient has a V pattern exotropia, and this patient has a V pattern esotropia. So we do oblique muscle surgery in addition to horizontal muscle surgery when there is associated over elevation in adduction or an inferior oblique overaction. So the horizontal surgery is guided by the primary position deviation. So if it is only a 1+ inferior oblique overaction, we don't do. For others, we have a wide array of procedures. You could choose from any of these. An inferior oblique, the maximum possible recession is 12 millimeters. So if you want to tweak it up, you can anteroposition the muscle. You can bunch up the muscle. If you remove a segment of the inferior oblique, then effectively you are tightening the muscle. This should not be done if you don't want that additional weakening. So you should not remove a segment because inferior oblique doesn't have any tendon. So if you cut the inferior oblique, you introduce a measure of unpredictability in the recession. So these are various recession schema that you can do. So from my mentor of Pradeep Sharma sir's book, this is the modified Elliott-Nankin. This is total anteropositioning and Fink's recession. So we come to inferior oblique exposure. I generally prefer using a phonics incision. We do the force duction testing. So you have to retropulse the globe. I generally prefer using a phonics incision in less than 30-year-old patients or even in older patients, and only the inferior oblique has to be done. So you may not hook the lateral rectus. In this patient, I hooked it. See the anterior edge of the inferior oblique before you go ahead to hook. I usually use 2 Stevens hooks to hook the inferior oblique. And everything has to be done under direct vision because the vortex vein is there. So as sir always says, this is the posterior triangle. This means you have reached the posterior border of the inferior oblique. Clear up the intermuscular septum. These are 2 Stevens hooks that I have used. So once you have cleared up the intermuscular septum, Dr. Kushner makes Burton Kushner makes a very important point here. Don't pass the sutures before you cut the muscle, because you'll be removing a segment of the muscle. You will be introducing an inadvertent anteropositioning. So you can just cut the muscle and then pass the sutures. So again, the same locking bites that Vaishnavi showed you in a 2-1-1. So make sure that you have included the posterior border of the inferior oblique as well, so that it doesn't insert over a wide area. So having done this, so you have a wide variety of weakening procedures. So this is the lateral rectus, this is the inferior rectus. So this is the modified Elliott and Nankins procedure that we commonly do for 3+ inferior oblique overactions. Second is 5 mm behind. Make sure there is no sag. And also that the inferior rectus has not been included in the surgery. So for very severe inferior oblique overactions, you can go a little nasally, short of a nasal antero positioning. You could hitch the inferior oblique, bunch it up at the center of the inferior rectus. So the more nasally you go, the more severe the weakening and the less the chances of antero positioning. But I mean, nasal antero positioning has also caused antero positioning, so we should be very wary of this. So I have bunched up the inferior oblique at the center of the inferior rectus. So all these inferior oblique antero positioning, when you go in front, causes a baggy appearance of the eyelid. So should be done only in very, very indicated cases. So Park's recession again from Sir's book. So you can do it if there is a little bit of DVD there. So first is 2 mm lateral, and the second is 3 mm posterior. The ski Park's point. And after you do that, the next bite is 5 mm posterior. So again, you need to take all precautions that you should be able to see the needle all along. So this is a patient with inferior oblique overaction, around 3+ inferior oblique overaction. Again, the grading that from Sir's book we have followed. So if you see, after surgery, this patient has a V pattern exotropia, not the large V. The V pattern has collapsed. Inferior oblique myectomy, I mean, largely of historical interest, rarely do it primarily because if there is a residual overaction, residual overaction of the inferior oblique, you really have trouble, looking for it. Sometimes you're not able to find it out. Sometimes you're able to find it. It's an unpredictable procedure. It has been touted largely for its auto-adjusting properties, but I mean, primarily for historical interest, I have very rarely done it. So the inferior oblique can be used to manage a lost inferior rectus. Please note that it causes unpredictable torsional deviation also. So the patient, even though may appear aligned, may not be diplopia free. The advantage is that ciliary vessels are spared, useful in traumatic cases because you have lost one vertical rectus muscle. So this was one patient. She said cosmetically she was better, the diplopia was better, but she did report some slanting of the image. So following a bull gore injury, the inferior rectus was injured way back, even behind the posterior pole of the globe. So we couldn't retrieve it. I did an inferior oblique antero positioning at the center of inferior rectus. So you see that the deviation is corrected, but she was diplopia free only in up, with the chin tilted a little bit down. In other positions, she said she had an unpredictable tilting of the image, possibly because of the torsional action. So you can have inferior oblique surgery is not a very forgiving surgery. The worst complication you can have is an injury to the vortex vein, which is very difficult to arrest. So everything has to be, prevention is always better than cure, and everything has to be done under direct vision. There should be no blind fishing around with the hook. So of course, and fat prolapse, another important thing, happens if you are like in a great hurry and trying to cut the intermuscular septum without realizing that you are actually cutting the septum. And pupillary dilatation, usually transient. Injury to LR and macula, very, very rare. And overcorrections can happen. Fortunately, they are transient, but you can have anti-elevation syndrome if you go to the +1 station for inferior oblique antero positions. So we move on to weakening procedures on the superior oblique. So you can have tenotomy or tenectomies and tendon expanders and so on and so forth. And of course, you have a number of strengthening procedures as well. The indications are pattern deviation and inferior oblique palsy, very, very rare condition, and Brown syndrome. It's a very important condition. So this is the most common condition. This patient has a A pattern esotropia, and this patient has a pattern exotropia. If they don't have oblique overactions, please don't touch the obliques. But if they do have oblique overactions, then you actually need to do the obliques. And this is my personal preference. 1+ you don't do. PTSO can be done. If you combine it with frenulum lysis, then the effect of PTSO actually increases. So this is again from Sir's book. I mean, he has been my mentor all along. So this is a PTSO video. So we hook the superior rectus, and immediately behind the insertion, you will find the superior oblique. You don't have to fish around for it. The only thing here is if you do an aggressive dissection, you can actually injure part of the superior oblique. So that you need to be careful. And we measure a 10 millimeter segment. That's what happened here. I injured a bit of the superior oblique. We spare the anterior 1 millimeter and do a little bit of frenulum lysis that actually packs a punch. In the anterior 1 millimeter, 10 millimeter segment is removed. So here again, you can have the same complications of injury to vortex vein and all. So, and of course, fat prolapse. So please do everything under direct vision. Do not attempt to do anything without directly seeing. So this is a patient after superior oblique tenotomy. So if you see here, the superior oblique is overacting. Superior oblique is overacting. This has been addressed after this tenotomy. And this is a patient with A pattern strabismus. You note the deviation is large on looking down. This has been addressed with surgery. And I would just play a video of a chicken suture that I used to. I don't do the chicken suture now. I do a split tendon lengthening or a hangback recession of the superior oblique. Because if you read Su's paper, Dr. Su had published a series and he had used adjustable chicken sutures. But there is a very small I mean, he has just made a passing mention that he had a 29% incidence of superior oblique palsy. So these chicken sutures, I have also had a couple of incidents of superior oblique palsy. This is a little difficult to reverse, even though you're using a Ethibond suture and you do FDT to confirm. Even though you're using a Ethibond suture, you still can introduce late superior oblique palsies. So same thing has happened after expanders also. Okay, occasionally, I mean, you have a 10% incidence of superior oblique palsies if you follow them up for 5 to 10 years. So I've shifted to split tendon lengthening, or as Sir uses a hangback recession. So this is a patient with superior oblique overaction. It's corrected with a chicken suture. Touchwood has been doing fine so far. You can have residual overaction. You can induce a torsional diplopia. Injury to SR and LPS. Overcorrections fortunately are rare because we don't do full tendon procedures. Like we don't do free bulk stenotomy is no longer practiced. So, and thank you so much for your attention. I'll stop sharing. Dr. Arun, any comments?
Wonderful surgeries. I think really it's a very nice procedures, and I think when Dr. Pradeep Sharma is there, we would all like to hear from him and be talking.
Yes, sir.
It's wonderful. I think all very nice compilations of surgeries shown. And regarding the illustrations from my book, you are free to use them. I would rather suggest you can use the color photographs which are there in the second edition, because these are all from probably the first edition. It will add a little more color. So you are free to all use them. Yeah.
Sir, I just have one comment regarding the newer procedure of antronasal transpositioning of inferior oblique. Have you had any experience with that? I have tried it with one patient and it worked, especially with very high inferior oblique overactions. It has worked quite well. And any experience with that, sir?
You asking me or Murli? No, I have used lots of ATIO, and we have actually published some work comparing the results with the modified Elliott Nankin. It is definitely a very good procedure for a 3+ or 4+ overaction.
Yes.
So in fact, I have seen that we don't have to do inferior oblique myectomy at all. Even for the most severest forms of inferior oblique overaction, you can make it a little more nasal positioning for the anterior nasal positioning, and it serves very well. So this is a very nice procedure devised by Dr. Stager, and I would recommend that whenever you have a 3+, 4+ inferior oblique overaction, you should do that. In my talk, I think I'll show you a small clip of the surgery which is done. I think many of the people are now, initially they thought it's a little difficult procedure. I remember Dr. John from Denmark had come and visited me once, and after that he's now promoting it like anything. He says such a simpler procedure and we were not taking account of it.
Yes.
Yeah, so you can use that.
Yes, sir. Just one more question to Murli, sir, which I had. Sir, I usually do cautery before I cut the muscle on inferior oblique because I feel the bleeding is a lot. What do you feel, sir? Because that's how I've been trained. So I cauterize. Is it? I noticed you didn't. So
No, I don't cauterize it if I'm not doing a mectomy. I mean, I rarely do a mectomy, so I
okay.
usually don't cauterize.
So,
Actually,
I mean,
Dr. Shruti, you must have noticed that is the technique which I think Murli is following, what we also follow. He asked the assistant to hold it with a serrated forceps after disinserting the inferior oblique. So once it is held in the forceps, it will not bleed. And then he's passing the sutures soon after that. So that will then prevent it. So you don't have to cautery. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
shall we move on to the next one?
Yes, sir.
Now I request Dr. Shruti Deep. Dr. Shruti Deep is a senior consultant in pediatric ophthalmology at MN Eye Center, and she'll be talking on your ready reckoner for transpositions and overview of available options and how to choose. Over to you, Dr. Shruti.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murli. I'll be talking. Can you see my slides, sir?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so we'll be talking about transposition surgeries in this talk and what are the options available. So it was Hamilshim who initially started off with the technique of transpositions in 1907, where he transferred in a sixth nerve palsy, he transferred the superior and the inferior rectus to the lateral rectus muscle. So basically how do transpositions work? They change the vector of the muscle. So they make the antagonist go into an agonist kind of a vector and also provide a kind of a passive restraint, like a tone to hold the eye in primary position. Now, we should also remember that the innervation to this muscle doesn't change and it works similar to the Hering's law. Why do we choose transposition surgeries? To improve the primary position deviations, especially in large deviations where small recessions might not work, and to improve binocular diplopia free field, to improve the anomalous head posture. We should also note there is an improvement in the field of paralysis. However, it might be limited, and that's probably because of the spring load effect. Here, this is how the binocular diplopia free field can be increased through the transposition surgeries. So selection of patients is very important. So when we have a squint, it's important to do a FDT and an FGT. When we do an FDT, if it's tight, we should always add a recession of the antagonist. If it is free, then a FGT, if the FGT is present, then we do a resection or application of the affected muscle. If it's absent, we can definitely plan for the transposition surgeries. Just a few tips before we start off on the procedure itself. Marking of the conjunctiva prior to the start, I have found it to be useful because there's a lot of torsional component involved when we kind of do transposition surgery. So it helps to mark the 6 and 12 positions before we start off. Fornix incisions work pretty well for these. However, when we're doing large transposition procedures like LR to MR, it would be prudent to do a 360-degree conjunctival limbal peritomy. Posterior dissection is extremely important in transpositions because we are going to need the fluidity of movement to move the muscles around, and using non-absorbable sutures wherever required, like a 5-0 polyester or a 6-0 polypropylene is very important. Foster's augmentation suture wherever required. We just put a suture about 8 mm behind wherever we're going to transpose so that it adds to the vector force. And of course, because we're moving the muscles a lot, pain management is very important in these cases. We'll need to address the pain, post-operative pain. Now, this is a patient who is a DRS with an EZO. He had a small face turn and a limited abduction, as can be seen. So the choice of procedure, what I prefer is a superior rectus transposition. Because he had a very small EZO, I didn't do the medial rectus recession because his FTT was not negative. So how the procedure works is we just take the superior rectus and then we place it along the spiral of Tillot. So we use a superiotemporal Fornix incision, as can be seen here. And once the superior temporal Fornix incision is made, the superior rectus is isolated. Once it's isolated, it's very important to kind of dissect it a little posteriorly so that we allow for the movement of the muscle. Then we hook the muscle with, you can use, here I've used 6-0 Vicryl because I'm not going to be pulling it a long distance. And then we hook the lateral rectus and we place it along the so usually I use a Moody's hook to mark the superior rectus lateral end and the lateral rectus superior end in order to have an idea of where the spiral is. And then with that, we place the sutures and we can add an augmentation suture if required. So post-operatively, he did well and there was a little bit of improvement in his abduction as well. So the other options are, of course, talking about the other options are the Hammersheim procedure, which where you have to take half the muscle of the superior and the inferior rectus and dissect it about 10 to 15 mm behind, and then attach it to the lateral rectus superiorly and inferiorly. We could also do a modified where we kind of resect maybe about 4 mm of the muscle before we kind of attach it superiorly and inferiorly. This leads to an augmented effect. The Jensen's procedure has also been explained, where we use a non-absorbable suture to tie the halves of the superior and the lateral and the inferior and the lateral together. The modified Nishida's procedure is a ciliary sparing procedure, vessel sparing procedure, where we just take a non-absorbable around 8 to 10 mm behind, and we kind of make take a partial, like maybe around 1/3 of the thickness we involve, and we can or may not use a scleral insertion here, and then we kind of attach it 8 mm behind the lateral rectus superiorly and inferiorly. The newer thought is to augment it with Botox. This is not a intraoperative, it's just a surgical, just a procedure to showing how the Botox is done. Augmentation with Botox helps in better postoperative effect, and it also helps in immediate post-op good outcomes. So here we see that this is Dr. Sandra's procedure, where we use a superior rectus bridle forceps, and then we just hook the, we just hold the medial rectus muscle, and then we take about 2.5 units of Botox, and then we go parallel to the medial orbital wall, and then we inject it straight down. So that's how the Botox works. And with this augmentation, sometimes the outcomes are much better. The third nerve palsy, coming over to third nerve palsy, it's important before we go into it that when there is a primary position horizontal deviation, we prefer with no verticals, we can prefer a split tendon transposition. When there is a presence of a vertical deviation, the full tendon transpositions have been described. And of course, the presence or absence of diplopia has to be evaluated. So the Y-split of the LR transposition to the MR was suggested by Taylor, where we do a 300-degree conjunctival limbal peritome. The LR is split about 15 mm towards the posterior septum, and using non-absorbable sutures, the muscle is passed, 2 halves of the muscle are passed superiorly under the superior rectus and the superior oblique, and inferiorly under the inferior rectus and the inferior oblique. Using a gas hook with the hole in the middle helps us to pass it through the muscles, and this will help us in improving the final primary deviation. So here you can see the Y-split. It's very important to go really posteriorly to get the right exposure, so that we don't put the right pressure on the globe. And this is how it would look from above. And of course, there have been reports of where we can do crossed adjustables also in these situations to bring about correct alignment. Now, when there is a hypertrophy or a hypotrophy associated with third nerve palsy, we could do a full tendon transposition of the lateral rectus to the medial rectus with augmentation sutures. Here, if this patient, this was reported by Professor Rohit Saxena sir, and here we see a hypertropia. And here what he did was he passed the lateral rectus through the inferior aspect under the entire muscle through the inferior aspect, and attached it to the medial rectus. And the post-op outcomes are pretty good. The other options, when there are very high deviations like 80 prisms or more, then we do a medial periosteal anchoring. Here what we have to do is we anchor the entire globe to the periosteum, and this is done. This was done by Sharma sir. Here we do a transcutaneous incision at the medial orbital wall, and then we take 2 sutures there, non-absorbable sutures, and then we go through the medial conjunctiva and pull the sutures out, and then we anchor them in front of the medial rectus and then tie them so that the globe comes physically moved to the primary position. So this, and the other procedure that has been explained was a lateral wall fixation, orbital wall fixation of lateral rectus, where the lateral rectus is tagged with a 6-0 non-absorbable, and then it is taken through the through the subconjunctival area in 5 mm behind the lateral orbital wall, and then it's sutured to the periosteum there. So it relieves the lateral rectus pull on the globe, thereby bringing it to primary position. So this can also be done for high deviations. About monocular elevation deficit, if the FDT is positive, it's imperative to do an inferior rectus recession first. But in the cases where the FDT is negative, we could plan for a NAPS procedure in the first stage itself. If there's less than 20 PDs, NAPS alone would work. If it's more than 20 PDs of hyper, then an augmented NAPS where we apply a Foster suture can be added. The newer publication now has come from Dr. Gandhi et al. Says about single muscle transposition, where they have tried just taking the lateral rectus and then attaching it to the superior rectus. But here they add an inferior rectus recession to this as well. And they provide, they say that the improvement is really good, as can be seen here. Okay, so I'm going to be ending with this heavy eye syndrome. We know that in high myopia, there is an increased axial length and less space for the globe to grow, and hence it goes as a into the supratemporal orbit, thereby causing a nasalization of the superior rectus and inferiorization of the lateral rectus. The angle between the two usually gets more than 180 degrees. In these situations, what we could do is we could tie up the lateral and the superior about 14 mm behind with a non-absorbable suture. This is called the suture loop myopexy. This is a short video of that. Here we do a supratemporal fornix incision, and we hook the lateral rectus. And once we hook it, we kind of nicely clean it behind and separate it and take about 14 mm. And we take a non-absorbable suture and take about half thickness of the 1/3 to half thickness of the muscle. We tag it with a double arm spatulated 5-0 polyester. So once we do that, we isolate the superior rectus, and again we kind of nicely separate the fascia behind and expose it to about 15 mm behind. And once that is done, here again you can see me measuring the 14 mm and marking that, and we use the other arm of the spatulated needle to kind of take the second incision here and then pull these two ends both together physically, and thereby it kind of allows the prolapsed globe to go back together. And once it goes in, you can see the muscles coming together beautifully, and the sutures can be tied up into a knot. So here you can see this is the lateral, and this is the lateral, and this is the superior rectus, and they have been brought together. Once it's done, the suture knots can be cut and conjunctiva can be closed. So this was the girl who had the heavy eye syndrome, and her improvement is quite good, with improvement in abduction as well. So the usual complications of transposition surgeries are, of course, anterior segment ischemia when we handle too many muscles, which is very important to assess before we start choosing what muscles we're going to transpose. Undercorrection is a common fallout of transposition surgeries. It's never almost always enough. Induced vertical deviations are another issue, and torsion is something we'll have to keep in mind. The take-home message is proper evaluation. Choosing the right procedure, the right muscles is imperative. Pain management is of utmost importance, and a good follow-up is also mandatory. I thank Dr. Murali for giving me the opportunity, and I thank my mentors from Shankar Nethralaya. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rakshati. I have a few questions. One is, how do you choose between a single muscle transposition and two muscle transposition? Like you mentioned, only superior rectus transposition for the lateral rectus, and you also mentioned the lateral to the superior rectus. So how do we choose between the two, and in which patients would you do an Ishida procedure?
Sir, now I generally feel the superior, just a single muscle transposition works equally well as that of two muscles. So I generally prefer a single muscle transposition. I use ciliary muscles whenever I feel that the other muscles are not going to be having a good, whenever there is a resurgery, or in cases where I doubt that the lateral rectus has a good supply. So otherwise I stick to a superior rectus transposition in most cases, and I feel the outcomes are pretty good.
So in case you do a superior rectus transposition and you have an undercorrection, can you add you have given Botox and you have done a superior rectus transposition, can you add an inferior rectus transposition to correct the undercorrection?
Yes, sir, I think so. Maybe a ciliary sparing, vessel sparing procedure like Nishida's can be done as an augmentation after that as well. I don't have an experience with the resurgeries for that, but maybe we can definitely.
Any comments, Dr. Arun or Vaishnavi?
Very nice presentation, Shruti. Yeah. I just have a single doubt. So how long do you wait before you take the patient up for any transposition in case of nerve palsy?
Yeah, we wait for the 6 months. I wait for 6 months, and then we plan for the surgeries.
Dr. Arun, any comments?
No.
Sharma sir, any comments, sir?
No, as you said, we can add the inferior rectus whenever there is a thing. In fact, I remember once we had planned for I mean, the resident was supposed to do, and at that time there was some difficulty. To only one half was done of the VRT, Hemi VRT that we do, and there was an under correction. So next time the other one was done, and definitely it worked. So it does have an additive effect whenever you do with so SRT will have a lesser effect than PVRT. That means even a partial VRT. And if you can add both, it will be more effective. And whenever there's a pre-operative hypertropia or hypotropia, then I would suggest using either an IRT or SRT in that respectively. As even Dr. Velez has shown that if there is a pre-operative hypertropia, then one should do an IRT, inferior rectus transposition, and if there is a pre-operative hypotropia, then choose to do a SRT. But if there is no pre-operative vertical deviation, it is preferable to do a modified Nishida or a partial VRT as we are suggesting.
So regarding the LR to MR transposition, you have a number of procedures for third nerve palsy like deactivation, globe fixation, and LR to MR. How do you choose between these three, and which is your procedure of choice?
So it depends on the amount of deviation to start off with. So if the deviation is less, maybe if it's too much like 80 prisms and above, then I probably I have done one orbital fixation. Otherwise, I stick to doing the split, and if there is no vertical deviation, I split and I bring it to the medial rectus. That's what I prefer.
Sir, any comments, sir?
I think again we would depend on the foot suction test. If the FDT is very tight, then the LR to medial side would not be advisable. It may have problems. In that case, we usually do a periosteal fixation of the lateral rectus or a very large supramaximal recession. But if the FDT is mildly restrictive, then one can do an LR to MR shift. And that is becoming more and more commoner as we get more confidence. But yes, we did have a case in which we had developed a choroidal effusion syndrome, which we have published after an LR to MR transfer. And we had to release the sutures on the second day to relieve that. There was a uveal effusion and that caused the vision to drop. So one has to be very careful when you are doing an LR to MR shift.
The effusion was because of the pressure on the globe. So was
yeah. So in spite of doing even 20 millimeters of split, sometimes the vortex veins can be still encountered. There are several of them, so they make 4 of them, so they can come across in situations. So you have to relieve the pressures at that time.
Shall we move on to the next talk? Next, I invite my mentor, Dr. Pradeep Sharma, sir. I mean, he needs absolutely no introduction to talk. And thank you, sir, for joining us. It's an honor and pleasure. He'll be talking on what's new and happening in strabismus surgery. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Murli, and really a lot of thanks for having such a nice IC course, the Midas such as you have called it. It's a real pleasure to join this, and many of these things have been covered by the previous speakers. I may just highlight them. I don't know why this is jumping. So first of all, the incisions, what has changed first of all is the fact that we need to do a timely adjustment. And now we are saying again and again, we are not strabismus surgeons, but we are restoring binocular vision and stereopsis. This is also important for claiming insurance, that we do not just say that it's a cosmetic surgery. I don't know why it's jumping, so I think there's some problem. Coming to the incisions, the conjunctival incisions, I think initially Dr. Vaishnavi had shown a schematic diagram. The MIS, or the minimally invasive strabismus surgery described by Mojon and Mojon, is there. We need to be, this is jumping actually. So in this, as Mojon himself has described, that you need to relearn the transconjunctival suturing trasu technique. Otherwise, there will be a lot of problem. In this, you have to actually go forth and backward. This is a special technique that you need to learn. And in spite of this, the age which he has recommended is to be used is only 14 to 40. So there are lots of reservations. So I would rather say that one should miss the miss. The adjustable surgery has been talked about very nicely. There's some problem, I think I'll just see. So as I said, in the adjustable surgery, we do a hemi hang back in order to prevent a forward creeping. And we always usually prefer the technique as also shown by Dr. Arun, that we'll be using a 1.5 knot technique. And in the video, you can see that the steps are shown, that we will be marking at the point where we want the muscle to be there, but pass the needle. And this also gives us the widening of the muscle stump. You can start there and then come more into the center. So this ensures that there is no bunching of the muscle that you want, and also the creeping forward is prevented. And then there is a silk suture which is placed in between the sclera and the first knot. So this helps us in releasing the suture at the time of adjustment, which sometimes can be tricky. And another thing which I was suggesting was that, as I learned from Dr. Rosenbaum, that you can use the bucket handle suture. And at the time of surgery, you should check that the sutures are passing easily backward and forth. This is that bucket handle suture, which we can pass with the 6-0 Vicryl suture. And this will help us in holding the globe easily. And when you close the conjunctiva, you can let the sutures come through the central exposure as this, and just put the sutures on the side. So there are various techniques which you can use, either the 1.5 knot or the slip knot. Just like in COVID, we have the mask to do the sliding noose as well as the 1.5 knot. Just an example to show, this was a case of abducens palsy with bitemporal hemianopia. And it was very critical in him to adjust, because he wanted the esotropia to be corrected, which was 45 prisms, but he also had a bitemporal hemianopia. So if we had a slight overcorrection, he would complain of diplopia. So in this case, I did the LR plication of 8 and the medial rectus recession adjustable on 6 mm. And we found that we had to bring it forward to 3.5 mm. Now, such patients who are very critical or tricky, you need to have an adjustable procedure. Strengthening procedures, the resection is the technique which is mostly used, but nowadays I think the plication is now replacing for us most of the time, the medial rectus particularly. You can do a plication, and most of you may have seen this video on the YouTube, and it's a very simple procedure which can be done. This is showing you the medial rectus being hooked through the fornix approach, and then the medial rectus is exposed, the intramuscular septum is dissected on either sides, and about 8 to 10 mm separation, and then you mark it. The marks are the same as you would have planned for your resection. No different measurements have to be taken. And once you have passed these 2 interlocking bites with the 6-0 Vicryl suture, because it's a strengthening muscle, you need to be sure that the muscle is nicely in your grip. And then just in front of the insertion, and this muscle, sclera muscle. Now this is what I call as the reinforced plication. This is important that it prevents the regression effect which people have reported. And then it nicely, you can see it can fold on an iris upholster. For the near distance disparity, we have convergence access tackled by the Farden operation or the posterior fixation on the MR. But for the lateral rectus, since the Farden doesn't work on the lateral rectus as good, we have used the combined resection recession technique on the same lateral rectus. And this is the So here it's actually simple. What you are doing is on the lateral rectus, you are marking the resection, and that component you are going to resect. You just need to plan how much resection and how much recession. Now this is X and Y, and this we have mentioned as a formula you can use on the basis of the preoperative deviation and the effect that you want on the lateral side, that it should have an incompetence created, or for the distance that you want to create lesser effect on the lateral rectus. So this is the resection part. And then, so if it is done, then the recession may be more than this part. If it is the same amount as the resection, it will give you an effect of an adjustable Farden as described by Alan Scott. So here it may be 2x the y, and that will give you the added effect of weakening the lateral rectus. The added y is giving you the effect on the primary deviation correction, and this Farden component gives you the effect on the abduction or for divergence axis. For the inferior obliques, I think nicely covered by Dr. Murli. I wouldn't like to go into any more details. Just to tell you about the anterior nasal transposition as was being asked. Now, this video is a small video on the anterior nasal transpositioning. The inferior oblique, as it was disinserted for any other modified iliac Nankin or any procedure, the same way you do it. But now you hook the inferior rectus and unroof the conjunctiva on the inferior rectus. Intermuscular septum on the nasal side of the inferior rectus is nicely separated, and this area is cleaned. Now you can get the inferior oblique just crossing over underneath the inferior rectus or inferior to the inferior rectus. And now 2 millimeters nasal and 2 millimeters posterior you mark, and this gives you a point as described by Stager. And this is very effective for controlling a 4+ inferior oblique overaction. So it's a very simple surgery, doesn't have a problem in doing, and you can just get the conjunctiva back closed. The inferior oblique does change the fundus torsion. In coming to the superior oblique, we have several procedures. The tenotomies, temporal or nasal, both are out of my recommendation. Tenectomy also I would not like to recommend because of the risk of superior oblique palsy that may be created. Z or L tenotomy you may do. Posterior tenectomy or posterior tenotomies again can be done for mild to moderate superior oblique overactions. The anterior tenectomy has been talked about for correcting the torsion, weakening the torsion. And similarly, the differential recession of the anterior fibers is a newer procedure which has come up. The more commoner procedure, which nowadays I'm doing for a Brown syndrome to weaken the superior oblique, is a hangback loop tenotomy. The silicone expander also I have used earlier, but I find this puts a problem in that thing that you may have a fibrosis in that area. So I have stopped doing the silicone expander as much, and hangback loop tenotomy is the preferred procedure nowadays that I do. The posterior tenectomy and translational recessions, you have all seen them. They have been in the past done. The loop tenotomy, I'll just show you a video. Now this is the child requiring in a case in which there was a tight superior oblique. On abduction side is good. So you, again, as I said, we have to approach all the superior obliques from the temporal side. So it's a superior temporal incision that was made, and you hook the superior oblique. See, the superior oblique has been nicely hooked, and intramuscular septum on either side are dissected, and then the superior oblique is dissected free and held with the fixation forceps. Make it free so that it can be released fully. And then for this, I am using the 50 Ethibond suture, non-absorbable suture. Make pure FDT free. In a Brown's case, this you have to do it. And then you pass the sutures. This is an hang back. So it's an adjustable thing. Intraoperatively, you can hang back the amount of superior oblique lengthening that you want to create. This is, so wherever you put, you can go back and recheck if your FDT is fully taken care of or not. So once it is done, then you can close the conjunctiva. So this is much neater procedure than a chicken neck suture. And this is the post-op result. For superior oblique strengthening, we have been doing tuckings, stenoplications, modified Harada Ito and the classical Harada Ito. The choice, of course, is the modified Harada Ito. Because of short of time, I think I'll skip this part. Coming to the transpositions, there are several options which we can add on. Partial tendon BRT or a full tendon BRT, a single muscle SRT or IRT, as was talked about by Shruti nicely. Augmentation by resection on these vertical rectors that we want to transport would be further adding the effect, or augmentation by Foster sutures may be also added. Augmentation also can be done by cross section as we have described. in partial VRTs also. And a plus effect can be got by antagonist medial rectus recession or the Botox, as again was shown by Shruti, and agonist LR plication can also be done. So these are several procedures. I'll just show you schematic diagram of the partial VRT. And this is very effective procedure. It corrects the marked esotropias in addition to the MR recession, which has been done in this case, and gives you a very good abduction, as you can see. And because we are using a partial VRT, we are having a control on the vertical deviations and also the torsions, which do occur. And even though Dr. Hunter's group may say that it is very little, but the later publications, they have admitted that it is there. So one can do that. Modified Nishida is a good procedure, which now we are finding more and more useful because there is no disinsertion, no splitting, no risk of anterior segment ischemia. We are directly vectorizing the force through the sclera. I say this is like direct bank transfer technique when there is no pilferage from the middleman. So the middleman, which was there in Jensen's procedure, the paralyzed muscle itself is a procedure which should better avoided because the effect may be lost in time. So modified Nishida is a very good procedure, and this is a vessel sparing surgery in a way, and this can be done. Coming to, I remember Dr. Joseph Deemer took a very nice lecture on sagging eye and the heavy eye. So using the technique of modified Nishida, I have changed the technique for the SR-LR loop myopexy, and it's now relatively easier that I would do. Bilateral MR recession if the FDT is tight for MR, and the loop myopexy is shown in this video, which you can see. This is a superior-temporal incision, fornix incision made. The superior rectus is being hooked. The important part is that you need to separate the intermuscular septum on the nasal side so that the superior rectus is totally free to move. Otherwise, your effect is not good. So this is what has been done, and you can mark it 8 to 10 mm from the insertion. You don't have to go 14, 16 mm as originally described, because even this works pretty well. And 50 ethibond sutures are passed, imbricated into the superior rectus. You can have full width transfer, and you can have more if you have a large nasalization of the superior rectus. And then you bring it closer to the superior rectus, mark it at the same point, pass it into the sclera. So it's important that we also imbricate the sclera with these sutures, and then pass it into the muscle again. Now this is what is important, that the superior rectus is very nicely displaced on the lateral side. And once this is done, then I will pass it into the lateral rectus. The lateral rectus relatively is more easy to maneuver. So you can pass these two sutures back into the lateral rectus and then tighten your sutures this way. Both these sutures. Yeah. So I would just complete this, and this is how we can just finish with this. And these have been talked about by Dr. Shruti. I may not go into the details of this. And the targeted strabismus surgery is what we talk about. Just a note about Kenneth Wright's procedure of a mini tenotomy, which is a post-op 3 to 4 millimeter cut shown. It corrects about 2 to 4 prism diopters by him. I have never tried because this is too small a correction that we may be targeting. Similarly, a mini plication is going to correct about 5 to 7 prism diopters, and this may be a procedure which one may try. I have never tried. The other procedures which have been coming on the horizon are the superior oblique tendon sheet stripping, repair of the IR flap tears, muscle transplantation, the resected segment lengthening, anterior tenectomy of superior oblique, as I said, and a very unusual procedure for nystagmus, the Sinski's procedure, which should be better avoided. So I think I'll just end at this talk that we have to be squintellectuals and plan our surgeries to restore the alignment. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, sir, for that enlightening talk. I have a few questions. So when do you recommend vessel sparing surgery? When would you recommend vessel sparing surgery?
In any person who is elderly, there is a risk that it will be a problem. But even children, I remember one case in which ESO-DRS, in which medial rectus had to be recessed because it was tight and a partial VRT was being done. There was anti-segment ischemia. So that is possible even in a child when you handle 3 muscles. So in that case, the modified Nishida procedure may be a welcome surgery. So, but whenever you have an elderly person who has problems with the circulation of any kind, thromboembolic conditions, then you better avoid 3 muscle surgery. And 2 muscle surgeries also sometimes you can have a problem. Even modified Nishida, you should be careful on the second day and see if it has not compromised the blood circulation.
Any role for anterior segment angiography either with ICG or fluorescence?
Yes, you can. If you are in doubt and if you have a possibility of doing it, you can do a prior preoperative anterior segment angiography. Yes, that can be done. Sure.
Any comments? Shruti, Vaishnavi, Arun, Dr. Arun?
Speechless with your surgery.
Mesmerized by your talk.
Very nice surgery, sir.
How long can we delay the adjustment if you put a muscle on adjustable? Dr. Arun and sir, how long can you delay the adjustment? Like people have talked about delaying adjustment for a very long time.
It would be desirable today, but I generally follow Dr. Eisenberg's technique of doing it 5 to 6 hours later. Dr. Rosenbaum, you would do 24 hours later on the next OPD. But I have seen that it is better to do it 5 to 6 hours because the adhesions don't develop. It's much easier to do the adjustments.
But Dr. Arun, if you're trying to say something, you're on mute. Please kindly unmute yourself first.
Sorry. So actually, I normally use only lignocaine when I'm doing adjustable suture surgery so that the anesthetic effect wears off fast. Avoid using bupivacaine.
Correct.
When do you choose to do adjustables? Like, what are your indications?
So that's what I said. No, resurgeries, very small angle surgeries, and whenever the patient is insisting that like he has to have a absolutely perfect, a very the type of patients who I think and are restrictive strabismus.
All right. With this, I guess if anyone is having questions, please go ahead. Because the next session will be chaired by Dr. Pradeep Sharma only, and he's already with us. So
yeah, there may be more panelists.
Sir, I have one question, sir, for Dr. Pradeep Sharma.
Yes.
Sir, can you please tell us how you exactly calculate that lateral rectus resection plus recession, same muscle?
Broadly speaking, I'm just telling you that there are 2 components. The resection component is X and the recession component is Y. So if you are doing an X equal to Y, it will give you an adjustable Farden effect. That means it will just act like a Farden.
Okay.
If you and then whatever you add on this, that X the Y is becoming like if it's 2X is equal to Y, that 1X effect will come for that correction for the preoperative primary position deviation.
Okay. Sure.
all right. With this, I would request Dr. Pradeep to conclude the current session so we can move ahead with the next session.
Not Pradeep, Murli to conclude the session.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Dr. Murli. Please conclude the session.
So thank you, Mr. Prasad, and thanks everyone for having this wonderful session. It was a real pleasure interacting with Pradeep Sharma sir, Dr. Arun, Dr. Vaishnavi, and Dr. Shruti. Thank you once. So we, other than sir, I think all of us will exit and we'll join Ridley Hall as audience.